Welcome, glad you're here. I'm Jen Lepore, Marketing Team Coordinator here at Custom Processing Services, and today we're talking about something that trips up even experienced product development teams. Why powders that behave perfectly in the lab can start acting completely different once you move to production scale equipment and real-world handling. Joining me is Jen Smith, Director of Quality at Custom Processing Services. And, Jen helps ensure that customers' products meet the highest quality and compliance standards through the manufacturing process. She works alongside internal teams and customers to support projects involving, dry ingredients, functional blends, and specialty particulates for food and beverage industry. Where the materials where getting scale up wrong can lead to texture defects, inconsistent flavor, failed dissolution, or costly rework. So thanks for being here, Jen.
Thanks for having me, Jen. And this is a great topic. This is something that I think everybody struggles with from time to time. So it's great that we're putting this together.
Perfect. So, before we dive in, can you just tell us a little bit about your role here at CPS and what kind of powder challenges you see most often coming from the food and beverage space?
Sure. So my role as Director of Quality at CPS really puts me in the hot seat of making sure that not only are we producing quality product day in and day out, right, to meet our customers' expectations, but that we're doing it in the most efficient way possible in our company. And so some of the powder challenges we find have a lot to do with maybe we didn't know enough about the powder when we scaled it up, which are things we're going to talk about today. Maybe the characteristics of the powder changed over time and we have to kind of find out why, right? So why is the particle size distribution different? Why is the flow characteristic of the product different? Why is it not fitting in the bag or the box or the sack anymore? So all of those things lead to some investigations, and my team and I really work side by side with our operations team to dig into those things and find out what's going wrong.
So let's start with the basics here. A lot of food and beverage companies feel like they've solved a powder once it performs well in the lab. It flows, disperses, and blends just fine. But when they scale up and suddenly things start to go sideways. So, how often do you see that happen? And what's actually really causing it, do you think?
Less than successful scale-ups are pretty common, especially when it comes to powder processing. The attributes specific to powders drive developers crazy, right? They tend to be very situation specific. Therefore, what works in the lab turns into a disaster on the plant floor.
So is this mostly an equipment problem, a volume problem, or something more fundamental about how powder behaves, changes under different conditions, you think?
I actually think it's something more fundamental. Equipment size and production volume certainly matter, but these are usually symptoms and not the root cause. Powders don't always behave the same way when you're making a few kilograms in the lab and then you scale up and you make hundreds or thousands of kilograms in production. Things like particle interaction, flow characteristics, moisture, heat generation, residence time, even how material feeds into the process all changes. So successful scale up is really about understanding those behaviors and designing the process so those critical product attributes are consistent regardless of the size of the process. I would say scale up isn't necessarily about making a bigger process. It's about making the bigger process match the small process.
So are there certain ingredient categories or particle characteristics that are particularly prone to this kind of scale sensitivity, you think?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think some materials are just naturally more sensitive to scale up because their behavior is dominated by surface effects rather than bulk or mass. So fine particles, especially when we're talking about micron or submicron size particles, which is what we deal with, are really more challenging. Things like cohesive strength, electrostatic charge, moisture sensitivity, all those things really change how the particles flow and how they respond to processing. I would say in terms of ingredient types, we often see more sensitivity with things like the pharmaceuticals, certain food additives, functional powders, anything where you've got very fine particles where the formulation includes sticky or hygroscopic materials. They don't always behave the same way when you move from these little small lab batches to these big high throughput systems. In practice, the more a material's behavior is driven by their surface interactions, right, the large surface area that we have on these fine particles, the more careful you have to be during scale up.
So when a scale up starts showing problems, where does it usually show up first? What's an early signal you think?
Yeah, I would say scale up issues show up in the most unglamorous places first. And it's not always the finished product. In fact, sometimes it's later in the finished product. The earliest signals, I would say, are in your process instability. Things like your inconsistent feed behavior, fluctuating pressures in your mill, for example, or even variability in the throughput are your first clues that something isn't translating right from the lab to production. With powders specifically, you might also see changes in how the material flows. It might bridge in the hoppers, or it might surge into the system. You might even have less consistent classification of the particle sizes themselves. So, interestingly, you could still hit the target spec of the finished product, but you'll see it becoming harder and harder to maintain. You'll have more variability batch to batch, or maybe even hour to hour. I think the early warning sign then is not really that the product's wrong, it's that the process is no longer stable.
So let's break down specific mechanisms here. So can you walk us through each of these? And I'm going to give you a couple and ask you some questions. So first, let's start with mixing energy and shear. So how do those change as you move to larger equipment? And what does that mean for powder performs in the finished product itself?
Yeah, you hit two of the big ones right away, right? Mixing energy and shear just don't scale in a simple one-to-one when you go from the lab to production. In smaller equipment, you get really uniform mixing, right? Because it's very consistent, it's very small, it's very concentrated in that volume. As you scale up, the energy is distributed across a much larger mass, and the nature of that mixing changes. You get more variation in the local shear and probably less uniform mixing overall. What that means in practical experience in powders is the powders will experience different histories as they go through the batch. So some particles might have a lot of shear and deagglomeration if they were maybe closer to the mixing shaft, for example, and getting a lot of that energy. And other particles will see very gentle movement if they're on the outer sides of that mass, maybe and further away from a shaft or a mixing blade. That's going to show up in the finished product as a change in particle dispersion, flow properties, compressibility, all these things that we talk about when it comes to how you're measuring your powder and your particle behavior. Even downstream, things like dissolution and blending can be impacted by that. Scale up isn't really just about matching the speed or RPM and taking it times X. It's about understanding how the energy is going to be distributed among your entire blend and among your entire powder system at that different scale.
So next, let's talk about ingredient addition order. Why does sequence matter, and what does it become harder to control at production volumes?
Yeah, ingredient addition order absolutely matters, and I don't think enough people think about that up front. It matters more than people expect because in powder processing, especially when you scale up, the order of addition influences how the particles interact with each other. So if you're taking something that is a very large particle and blending it with a smaller particle, and again, we're talking about microns, right? Making sure that they blend together is important. So if you put the small particle in first and the large particle on top, maybe they don't blend as well as when you reverse that order. Sometimes you'll get away with less control in a smaller scale because you can fix it through more mixing, right? If you're in your lab and you open up the container, it's not mixed well enough. I still see big particles, not mixed with small particles. You just turn the mixer on and mix it again. At large scale, it becomes much harder to fix that. You won't necessarily see the clumps until maybe you're just discharging the mass. And all of a sudden, halfway through, you start to see lumps and clumps and caking of the product that didn't mix well. So it's really hard then to fix that and remediate that. So it's something you have to address up front. So, addition order isn't just a recipe detail, right? We've all followed recipes at home and we know you add that in certain order. In powder processing, it's really a design parameter that you have to think about because it will affect your final particle dispersion, your flow behavior, and overall product consistency.
So next up is segregation during conveying and packaging. What drives it, and what do you think it looks like as a manufacturing problem?
Yeah, so again, you're hitting on all the key topics, right? The previous question flows right into segregation. So segregation is one of those problems, again, that doesn't always show up in the lab. but it becomes very obvious once you scale up and you're making hundreds or thousands of kilograms of powder. A blend may look very uniform when you make it, and then you convey it or transfer it or package it, and then the particles have opportunities to separate, right? So even if your mixing step now, we talked about the mixing, shear, and the energy, even if you've nailed that, now you're sending this powder all through the rest of your system. You have to ensure that it's staying homogeneously mixed through all of those other steps. So what drives that separation is really the particles themselves. Again, we talked about you can have larger particles and smaller particles, more dense particles and less dense particles, and they're all going to separate over time. So how you design your parameters to ensure that they stay together and mixed well is the key to having a successful scale up. Lighter particles are going to become airborne, heavier particles are going to settle to the bottom. So making sure you address that throughout the entire process is key. From a manufacturing standpoint, it sounds like a real headache, and it is. So one package can contain too much of a key ingredient, another package might not contain enough. It might affect flavor, color, texture, right? A box to box or a drum to drum variation to your customers is not something that would be acceptable. It could even impact regulatory compliance when you think about it, and the addition and the order of ingredients. Suddenly your process isn't repeatable because now you have this variation, and segregation is the reason why, right? These particles have separated out. Understanding the powder's physical properties is really the key in designing a process to minimize that segregation, right? To minimize that chance for separation is just as important as getting the recipe right.
Awesome. So let's talk about moisture pickup and caking risk, because you've talked a little bit about that. How does scale affect exposure, and why do some powders that seem stable in the lab cake up in the end in production?
Yeah, well, scaling completely changes the exposure of your product, right? In the lab, you're working with small batches. It's moving quickly from one step to another. The lab is probably a very, very controlled environment in terms of temperature and humidity. Suddenly you move to scale up where your plant conditions may not be as precisely controlled, and the conditions of your product are changing. The exposure time, the holding time, the transfer time, the packaging time, all of those extensions of time give the product more exposure to air and potentially humidity, right? And we talked about if the powder is naturally hygroscopic, meaning it's going to pick up water, it's readily going to pull that moisture out of the air, and it's going to cake and clump and bridge and cause all sorts of manufacturing headaches. The challenge is that, the powder performed perfectly in the lab. And so you checked all the boxes, it flowed, it did everything we wanted it to do. And now you get it into scale up and you're failing. And so did you take into consideration those conditions, right? Not only the environmental conditions of temperature and humidity, but also the exposure time and the dwell time different than what you made in the lab. So you're conveying, your packaging, your holding time in bins, and all of that additional time that it would have to pick up moisture and or heat maybe from friction in the process. And
let's touch on the last one. Lot to lot variability in particle size distribution and bulk density. How much does that actually move, and how does it go through the process?
Particularly from a quality standpoint, lot to lot variability in particle size and bulk density is something we always expect to see to some degree, right? We're never going to have something that is exactly perfectly the same every time. The key question is how tightly we can control it and how sensitive the downstream process is to those little changes in variability. Even relatively small shifts in particle size can have supersize effects when you move through a process chain. Examples in particle size variation can affect flowability, packing behavior, how material feeds into equipment like mills or blenders. And of course, your bulk density shifts can also do the same thing. So, the key is knowing that the variability doesn't always stay where it starts, it travels. So you could have the variability in the raw material, and suddenly now it's throughout your process. And again, the effects are amplified because now you're in this larger scale with longer dwell times, perhaps higher humidity conditions, all the things that we just talked about ahead of time, leading to now this ultimate, now I need to control the variability. And how do I do that, right? So I think the focus is less on eliminating it entirely and just making sure that you've designed your process to account for it and make sure that is measuring that and developing a system that will circumvent that.
So let's take this a little step further and talk about what all this means for the food and beverage manufacturers here. So when it comes down to food and beverage products, mouthfeel and texture are often the first things that consumers will notice. So what do you think the link is between the powder behavior at scale and those sensory outcomes?
You said it, mouthfeel and texture are the first places that you will see scale-up issues because they're directly tied to how particles behave at that little small micron particle size level, right? Subtle changes in particle size distribution or agglomeration affect things like smoothness or grittiness or how quickly something dissolves or hydrates. And so a consumer will pick that up. If the particles are slightly larger, a consumer will tell you the product is grainy or I don't like the texture, right? So it's key, and it means that range and that particle size distribution have to be right on every time. It also ties back to dispersion, right? We talked a little bit about something going into solution. At the smaller scale in the lab, again, because you had this nice tight control over mixing and shear, because you didn't expose it to a lot of humidity, there's not a lot of caking and clumping, right? All the things that we just talked about. The end result is a product that probably goes into solution, if that's what the end use is, very easily. You stir it up and wow, look at that. It made the great drink or the great solution that we needed it to make. At scale up, you do the same thing. You take some of your end product and you stir it up in a glass, and suddenly it doesn't go into solution as well. And that's because you probably have small pockets of poorly dispersed material. Remember, we talked about the mixing and the segregation and all those things. It led to a product that may not disperse in water the way that you wanted it to or the way that you expected it based on your lab trial. So even though we're talking about very technical powder behavior, right, the end result is actually something very simple. The product needs to feel smooth, consistent, and enjoyable to the consumer.
And this kind of going into my next question, dissolution issues are another common complaint. Is that usually a particle size problem, a wettability issue, or does it kind of depend?
Well, the short answer is it depends, right? As we just said, particle size is certainly a big factor because smaller particles have more surface area and generally dissolve faster. But that's not the only thing, right? We said wettability is just as important. So if it doesn't absorb the water or disperse well, it may have formed clumps, it may not dissolve. We've all seen that, right? When you mix a little drink mix into your water, you get these dry pockets no matter how much you stir. So at production scale, a lot of your process changes will influence dissolution and wettability of your powder. Your milling, your blending, your agglomeration, all those steps, even how the product's conveyed through the system will change how it behaves when it meets that liquid. So when a customer reports to us poor dissolution or they failed in kind of some of those areas, we don't assume that it's a particle size issue. We look at the whole process and the whole picture.
So flavor uniformity can be hard to pin down. When it's a powder related issue, what's usually driving it?
I would say that flavor uniformity, when it's off in a powder system, it's not a flavor chemistry issue. It's really what I'll call a distribution problem, right? And so, the flavor may be perfectly designed and it may be perfectly correct, but again, the problem is it's not going to be evenly distributed throughout your powder system. And oftentimes that's a result of all the problems you might face during scale up or all the challenges you face during scale up. Again, go back to powder behavior, segregation, differences in particle size, density between the ingredients, right? Poor deagglomeration during blending. All of those things will lead to an inconsistent flavor delivery system. If the flavor is carried on a finer particle or more cohesive particle than the bulk material, it might cluster up and you might get, a burst of flavor and then something that doesn't have a lot of flavor in it, all within the same powder mix. And that's unacceptable, obviously, to the customer, to the consumer. You'll also see, I think, when it's not homogeneous. We talked a bit about the mixing and the shear and how those particles will have different histories. It may be perfectly blended, but as you then convey it, it's going to segregate, again, leading to this inconsistent delivery of flavor in the final product, right? And even to the consumer end product. And again, I think most of the time flavor inconsistency is not really a problem of the flavor itself. It's really a problem of the product and the powder behavior.
Interesting. So on the operational side, how do flowability, dusting, and rework rates connect back to what we've been talking about? Are they mostly symptoms or do they feed back into quality as well?
I would think of these things as actually both symptoms and causes. I would say that they start out as symptoms of the powder that isn't behaving optimally. So you'll say, oh look, it's dusting or it's doing this, and then when you dig into it, you actually find that it is actually the cause of a problem, right? And that it needs to be corrected or redesigned. Take flowability. If the product doesn't flow correctly, you'll end up with inconsistent feeding, poor fill rates, blending problems, production slowdowns, maybe even inconsistent flavor uniformity that we talked about above. Dusting is similar, right? Besides creating housekeeping and safety concerns, it's going to actually change the composition of your finished product, particularly if you're losing all those finer particles. So rework is another good example. Every time you have to send material back through the system, you're exposing it to the additional handling. Remember, we talked about the exposure creates additional opportunities to pull that moisture from the air, right? So more caking and clumping. So these are all challenges that we've been talking about. And again, they're more than just operational inconveniences, right? They're things that will impact the quality of the finished product. And they're indicators that your process isn't working as intended, right? So when we have trouble in scale up, these are things that, again, you might think show up as symptoms, but truly are really root cause and problems that you have to redesign your process to solve.
So the food and beverage industry has a lot of variability in ingredient suppliers and use formats and regulatory sensitivities, as you, I'm sure, are fully aware. So what does CPS bring to the table for the food and beverage customers, dealing with the powder scale up that a general contract manufacturer might not?
Yeah, this is my favorite question. What CPS really brings to customers is the ability to translate that lab scale powder into a large, repeatable commercial process. A lot of customers come to us with a formulation that works in lab, but then behaved unpredictably for them at scale up. And they can't understand if it's a particle size issue, a flow issue, or just inconsistent performance in the final application. Here at CPS, we work across many different powder sectors. So pharmaceutical powders, food powders, industrial powders, and we've been able to see how all these different materials scale across all those types of systems, right? And the stress that scale up brings to those materials. And that enables us to quickly identify whether the challenge is related to particle characteristics or process conditions or even downstream handling. So our role is sort of part technical problem solver, but also sort of process bridge, right? So we help de-risk the scale up by making sure the powder behavior is understood and controlled before it ever reaches that commercialized production. And so that value and the collective experience here at CPS comes from all those different powder systems, right? We start to recognize patterns in how powders behave, especially when you go to scale, and then that helps us troubleshoot faster and then design better processes to support that.
So what does CPS's process actually look like, when a customer comes in with a powder that underperforming at scale? Where exactly do we start?
So we start, a lot about how we start out is collecting that information. So what is your powder? What do you know about your powder? And then what issues did you find you have, right? So really that data gathering, that discovery phase of understanding what they tried and what didn't work, but then really digging deeper. So let's take that back a few steps and let's understand your material. What is your raw feed? What do you need it to be? What are you trying to achieve in your finished product? And then the more that we can learn, the more we then go to our technical engineers in our group that will work on that solution and provide the right equipment to make that powder work for that company.
When those initial conversations happen, and you kind of spoke a little bit about it, what type of characterization data are most valuable? Is there anything you wish more customers came in already knowing about their material?
Characterization data is extremely important going into scale up. It really sets the foundation for how quickly we can develop that robust process. The more we understand about the material up front, the faster we can distinguish between a particle size problem, a formulation issue, a processing issue. We often wish, earlier in a conversation that we had a clearer picture of things like, what is your particle size distribution? We keep talking about that a lot. People need to realize that, particle size don't just come at 1 micron. They come in this little bell-shaped curve, right? So we can have this bell-shaped curve be very wide. We can have the bell-shaped curve be very narrow. And so what does that look like? What are your D10s, your D50s, your D99s? And then based on that, we can help to design a process to solve the problem. Most of that data doesn't solve the problem on its own, right? But it helps us to understand where their problem points were, and then we can fix the process and figure out how we're going to scale this for them. Without that baseline, without that characterization data, you end up spending more time understanding what the material is, right? So we'll even bring in some customer material and we will test it in-house using our own equipment and our own instruments in our labs to understand those characteristics that they may not know, right? And those are key to then designing the process to support that scale up. With that data, you can move much more quickly into design process and optimization. The one thing I would add, and this is something that we sometimes don't always know, but how the finished product is going to be used ultimately with the consumer. So a lot of times we deal with clients and customers where that information is very confidential. So we'll sign confidentiality agreements, but it's in order to get to that end use information, because that'll be very key to understand that behavior and design it into the process, right? Is it a powder going into solution? Is it a powder going into dry blending? In the pharmaceutical world, how is it being pressed into a tablet? Is it being put in a capsule? Those are all things that we need to know that will help us understand how to design the process.
Batch to batch consistency is obviously critical in the food and beverage world, especially when you're supplying to national brands or retail products. So when a customer moves into ongoing production, how does CPS make sure the consistency and repeatability are maintained from, one batch to the next?
Repeatability is at the core of what we do, especially for customers with the ongoing production needs. So our approach will start with defining that stable, well understood process window, right? Not just a set of conditions, but a window during that initial scale up work. And that's important because that means we're not just targeting that single set of conditions that might not be achievable. We've given this range that you can operate within. And that's the range where the material is going to perform as expected. So that's really important. From there, then repeatability comes from controlling both that process parameters as well as the material behavior, right? So variability, we touched on variability earlier. Variability in the raw feed is important. We want to make sure that has a nice, tight, narrow range around it, right? We'll measure that, we'll monitor that. And then, of course, we monitor our process and our operating conditions, making sure, any variations in the raw material are accommodated by that slight change in the processing conditions, all the while staying within that window that we've designed and developed. The goal is when the customer comes back, whether it's weeks or months later, we're not resolving the problem, right? We're executing within this known, validated window where the material and process relationship is already completely understood. Guarantees success.
So for an R&D or process engineer who's about to take a powder formulation into pilot scale for the very first time, what would you say are 2 or 3 things that should have nailed down before they even started?
3 things I'd want them to have nailed down. And the first is understand your powder, right? It's all these things we've been talking about on this interview today. Know your particle size distribution, know the bulk density, know the flowability, know the moisture sensitivity, whatever physical properties are likely to influence how it behaves, right? Those are the things you need to know. If you don't understand the material, you're going to spend a lot of time troubleshooting, and you could have anticipated those problems, right? So first is know your material, know your powder. Second, I would say should be really define what success looks like. Don't just say to yourself, I want to make this product and go into it with I'm just going to take my lab stuff and X times it, right? It's 3 times or 4 times or 20 times what I made in the lab and decide that that's how it's going to work. What are you measuring? Is it dissolution? Is it blend uniformity? Is it particle size, yield, throughput? What are your criteria for success? make sure you know them up front, and that way you'll know when your trial is truly successful. And then I would say the third thing is to go into your pilot trial with the mindset that you're there to learn, right? So pilot trial is the time where you actually want to discover those surprises, right? The more data you gather, the more things you learn, the more intellectual knowledge you have on how that powder behaves. So you're going to anticipate any type of scaling challenges where you can design the process to support those challenges as opposed to finding them out as a problem or a lack of production. The smoother the transition to commercialization will be as long as you know all that information.
So at what point, should a team stop trying to solve a scale-up powder problem internally and, bring it to a toll processing partner? What are the signs that outside expertise is the right call to make?
I don't think teams have that single moment where they suddenly realize they need outside help, right? It's more a pattern of signals. One of the biggest signals is probably when they've had multiple scale-up attempts and the outcome's still inconsistent or unpredictable, even when the formulation hasn't changed. I would say another sign is when the problem starts to look less like a formulation issue and more like this complex interaction between the particle behavior and the equipment and the process. And from day to day, it's flowing one day and not flowing the next day, right? And you didn't change anything, right? So that tells me that there's some signals that say we don't know enough about our powder behavior and we need to bring in some experts, right? It's understanding the system as a whole, and typically that's where CPS adds value. We bring both that specialized equipment, but also the experience across all those powder systems that I talked about earlier. So we can quickly identify if it's a fundamental problem with the material or the process or the scale itself, right? And keep in mind, our goal isn't to replace internal teams. It's really to bring that speed and shorten that path to a stable, scalable process so you can start generating revenue on that product.
So before we wrap up, here's a big picture type question. What's one thing about powder behavior at scale that more food and beverage manufacturers should understand, but often don't necessarily realize until they really end up running into problems and issues?
Yeah, I think we said it already. I think the biggest thing that food and beverage manufacturers could benefit from understanding earlier is that powders just don't scale in a linear way, right? We spent this time talking about this nice small lab process that worked. The powder was beautiful, it checked all the boxes, and then we went to scale up and things just fell apart, right? How did that happen? It happened because it's real production dynamics, right? The key issues are that powders are highly sensitive to things like segregation, flow behavior, small differences in particle size and bulk density, all the things that we talked about. At lab scale, those effects are masked, right? Because you're working in a very small, uniform, easy to control environment. And then you bring it out to production scale and those effects become amplified, right? I think I used supersized before and they're much more visible to everyone. The big lesson is that scale up isn't just about increasing batch size. So it's not just about the X times. It's really about anticipating how those powder behavior changes are going to happen when the system becomes more complex, more variable, and really just less ideal.
Yeah. So last question I have for you. What is one commitment you would want every food and beverage customer to make before they try to move a powder from bench to production floor?
I would say the one commitment I want every food and beverage customer to make is to treat the scale up as a learning process. It's not just a translation step, right? In other words, assuming that, it worked at bench, it's going to automatically work in the plant and I'm going to be done. This is going to be a no-brainer. That's just a misrepresentation of how powders behave. So you really have to be willing to understand the material. Again, how it flows, how it responds to processing, how the small variations can influence production. The more disciplined you are about characterizing those and testing those, the fewer surprises you'll have when you move to full production, right? So it's really understanding that it's a learning process, right? This isn't just a check the box mechanical process. The biggest mindset shift is realizing that powders are dynamic systems. It's not scaling recipe, right? It's really taking and understanding the characteristics and how that behavior is going to change over the scaling. If you go in expecting to learn rather than just replicate, I think you'll set yourself up for a much more predictable and reliable outcome.
Well, Jen, this has been great, and I appreciate you giving all the insights on the food and beverage sector. And thank you to everyone for tuning in to this episode of the Toll Manufacturer Minute. If you're developing or scaling powder-based products for the food and beverage industry and want a processing partner that understands how to get ahead or changes between the lab and the plant, CPS is always ready to help. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss our next podcast episode, and we'll see you then.